So feel free to help yourselves. I thought that I could make a couple kind of remarks to you all.
It's a house surprise.
As you all know, I never have a difficult time. But so far I've had over 60 postings on my Facebook account. So thank you. Some of you have posted things, and I appreciate that. The most interesting two ones that I got so far was one said, "You're a legend." I don't know what exactly that means. Is that a good or bad thing? But I'll take it. But the other person was Leonard Jason, who basically said, "Felicitous natal anniversary." When I first looked at that, I said, "Is this kind of clean? You know, felicitous natal." So I was trying to figure out what is natal. Same, you know what natal means?
For young.
So it's like it's your birth, so I had to kind of look up some of this. And felicitous, so it's a pleasing birth anniversary. But only Ariane Spurgeon, for those who know her, would say something like that. But interesting. So I just wanted to kind of mention that not only is this my 68th birthday, which I'm very proud of, being able to be around for this long, but also this is my 50th year in the field of psychology.
Wow. So let's do that again. You're how old?
So I'm 68. So let me explain to you how that works. Basically, I spent 42 years at DePaul University, but actually the 8 years before that were as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. And in my undergraduate studies and my graduate studies, I was becoming a psychologist. So I actually count that as being in the field of psychology for 50 years. And you know that, in a sense, some people say, how do you feel about, for example, your publications? 759 publications, that's quite a lot. 101 book chapters, 28 books. $36 million, $900,000 in federal grants. So basically, those are important accomplishments, but I think what's more important in terms of accomplishments are really the fact that I've been on 91 thesis committees and 96 dissertation committees. So I feel that's important, but in terms of the center, from 1999-2000 till today, when we started our center, we've had 228 RAs or volunteers get into graduate programs. And actually, if you go before 99, there's probably another large amount. So I just started keeping track in 99 and 2000. And for me, when I think about what's important, it's really kind of giving people opportunities to really get credentials so that they can go on and get into programs that will further their education. So some people have asked about myself in terms of my own training. And a lot of you probably wonder kind of what happened during that 8 years of being an undergraduate in a graduate school. I actually participated with the Humphrey Johnson presidential campaign of 1964 when I was in junior high school. And unfortunately, participating in that, we ended up in Vietnam War, which I wasn't happy about. So when I was in high school, our local congressman, who was anti-war, asked me to lead up Young Citizens for Elstowski, which I did in high school. And he won as the congressman for our district in northern New Jersey. But then he ultimately got indicted, and other things happened to him in Congress. So that was another kind of inkling that there were some issues in politics. Finally, when I basically was campaigning for Robert Kennedy, we all know what happened to him. And I said, maybe the best thing I can do is stay out of the political arena, which sort of cemented my interest in psychology even further. So, just letting you know, when I went to Brandeis University, I had the pleasure of having a class with a person who was actually pretty famous, named David Tresh. who actually, his real name was David Krzyzewski, changed it. But Kretsch was the person who, along with several colleagues, including Marion Diamond, in the early 1960s, found out that the brain was actually something that could change over time with an enriched environment. And he was also a person who started up SPICI, one of the people that started up that organization. So I had the chance to meet him, but what's interesting about David Kretsch, during the first seminar class which I took, and he was taking a sabbatical at Brandeis, he basically said that he had been directly descended. His teacher had been trained by Wundt. So I actually went back and tried to find that connection, but actually it does go back to Wundt. So during that class, he looked at us all and he said, I just want to let you know, I am going to pass on the mantle from Wundt to you. And he went around the class and he shook all our hands to pass on the mantle. That was kind of interesting. And again, just sort of a sense of how early the field of psychology had formed. So that was an impression that I had. But I went to Brandeis, in a sense, to actually work with Abraham Maslow, who was, as you all know, one of the founders of the humanistic psychology movement. Unfortunately, Maslow was at a time in his life transitioning out of Brandeis, so I only was there for about a semester or quarter when he was there. But I had a chance to meet with him and talk with him. But I also had a chance to take a class with Maury Schwartz, who was profiled in Tuesdays with Maury. And it was in that class that I met Roger Weisberg, and this was 1970. So Roger Weisberg, who is now the director of the Community Psych Program at the University of Illinois at Chicago, I've known for over 45 years. In addition, when I was at Brandeis, I worked with a guy named Chris Dowell, who was trained by Carl Rogers. So again, a direct connection with Carl Rogers. I also worked with my advisor, Emory Cowan, who was trained by Arthur Coombs, who was actually a student of Carl Rogers also. And actually, you can trace it back from Rogers, actually all the way back to William James, in terms of kind of the training. I also took a workshop with Fritz Perls, another person who started up Gestalt therapy when I was an undergraduate. Moving on, I had a chance to meet B.F. Skinner into the behaviorism field. And I took a class with James Holland at Brandeis, who was one of Skinner's students. And I actually had breakfast with Skinner at one of the kind of meetings. It's called MABA at the time, in West Association of Behavior Analysis in Chicago, in the early 70s. But I worked in a laboratory that was actually overseen by Stanley Sapone, who's linguistic. His area was linguistics, and he taught non-speaking children how to speak, who were 1 or 2 years of age. So I learned operant conditioning and actually took care of the rat colony when I was in graduate school. And it wasn't something that I had to do, but I was interested in finding out how we could have applied things that could actually make a difference in the community. Because I saw a lot of the community interventions being a little bit too imprecise. So that's when I started becoming much more behavioral. And I actually had a chance to, as an undergraduate also, learn from Brendan Marr. And he wrote the first abnormal psychology book. It was called Principles of Psychopathology, that was based on scientific principles, as opposed to the time, in the late 60s and early 70s, when really my field of clinical psychology was dominated by more psychoanalytic thinking. I also had a chance to meet Edmund Jacobson of the relaxation response. Some of you might have heard of Edmund Jacobson, who had direct influence on Joseph Wolpe and Cyril Frank. So again, directly connected with that. My funny story about Edmund Jacobson is that he was at the University of Chicago. He was the one who basically said, tense and relaxed muscles to get into the relaxation response. So I was in charge of the colloquium committee when I was at DePaul. I invited him here. He was in his 90s at the time. And he gave a presentation before a full house within the Schmidt Academic Center at DePaul. And in 10 minutes, he gave his whole presentation. And at the end of his 10-minute presentation, he started talking again, the same presentation, over the same thing. After another 10 minutes, he got to the end of his thing and he started up again, at which point I jumped up, started clapping my hands and said, thank you. I'll have enough of that, you know. But that was Edwin Jacobson. That was probably one of the last talks he gave. But again, interesting connection. In any event, because I was so behavioral in graduate school and so interested in more specific way of bringing about clinical change, they basically had me do internships with more psychoanalytic people so I could learn that particular tradition. So I had to do an internship at the Syracuse Veterans Administration, and at the Syracuse VA, I trained with a person named Howard Friedman. So I had to train on classic Rorschach, classic kind of psychoanalytic, and Howard Friedman was trained by Deutsch and Murphy, who was trained by Freud. So actually, again, directly connected back to Freud. I also worked with Rita Underwood at Memorial Hospital, Strong Memorial Hospital, who was basically an interpersonal psychoanalytic H.S. Sullivan training. So again, one can see in my career, starting out in humanistic psychology, really being like second generation, because at Brandeis at the time, there were lots of people there who had been working with Maslow, and I worked with a number of those people. In addition, moving into the behavioral field, as I went to graduate school, having some training in more psychoanalytic approaches, but I always kind of felt it was good to be trained by people who really believed what they felt. Were strong about that, but eventually I ended up going to a school. I think lots of things happened by accident, where I basically was at a clinical community training program. And it was Emory Cowan and Mel Zaks who basically happened to be at the University of Rochester. So because I was at the University of Rochester, I basically was able to learn this new field, 1971, of what's called clinical community psychology. And what Emory said, in the first year of grad school, a talk he gave before my class, was that, you know, clinical psychologists really are going to have competition from people who can probably deliver these services, paraprofessionals, potentially as effectively, or maybe much more cost effective. And because of the large demand and need for services, we need to be thinking about how we can deliver services more in a preventive fashion. We're thinking about how we can do consultation and how we can work with community grassroots groups. So basically, based on that lecture that he gave, I was transformed into a clinical community psychologist my first year of graduate school. And once I got to Chicago, I spent a lot of time with Jim Kelly on a more ecological model, and that was also a strong influence. So I just wanted to kind of tell you a little bit about my roots. My roots really go back to some of the founders of psychology, the founders of some of these different movements in psychology. And you know, what I would kind of advise is that, you know, when you have opportunities in your career to learn from people who have very strong opinions on a theoretical model, it's really good to sort of understand what it means to do classic psychoanalytic work, or how it means to do classic community ecological work, or even psychoanalytic work. I mean, because you get a chance to understand it in a way that's not superficial, as opposed to just blending everything together. So I think that's been a real advantage that I've had. So, as I was saying, this is my 50th year in psychology, and the reason I say that as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, and I know for yourselves, as undergraduates, if you've gone through, and prospective grad students, and some of you will be going into grad school very soon, you know, this is all training. And whether you're going to go into psychology or some other field, you know, this is a little bit of my background. So I'm going to pass on the mantle from Wundt to each of you by going around and shaking each of your hands so that I pass it on. And even that little one over there. I'm going to pass, because he's going to be a psychologist one day. So I just want to again thank you all for coming to my celebration. To Wundt. And there we go. That's from Maslow. This is from B.F. Skinner. All right.
Got it? All right. Thank you.
And the ball, I passed on to you, my colleague, like yourself. And we got to you. There we go. And thank you all, and again, I appreciate you getting together, and I hope this is a little bit helpful in terms of some of the historical issues I've gone through, and hopefully you folks will during your careers too.
I think it's as good a time as any to sing happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Dr. Jason. Happy birthday to you.
And many more. Many more.
And we do have a sort of gift. So there you go.
Well,
And the gift kind of is the box.
50 years, you got that right. All right, thank you very much.
That might take you a while. I'd open it up. You don't have to look at it all now. Of course.
And also that has something.
Wow. Excited. I like it.
I ate so many sweet things like mandatory. My skin was like kind of weird. A lot of vitamin A.
Yeah.
A lot of
Charlie's first words.
My first word was